All right, good morning, everybody. I think we've got a critical mass here so we can get moving. Welcome to our March 24th edition of what will hopefully be the last meeting of this particular work group. Don't see Dr. Kowalja on the call yet. So why don't we start off with why don't we skip the Cadmus low income study or the analysis and go into the PIM cost recovery. All right, I saw the utility submitted some information on the 22nd in response to some questions from OPC. Chris or Lindsay, or did anybody want to walk through those, or you just want to kind of open it up for questions?
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Judge McLean. Chris Walls with BGE. We're fine with just answering any questions that folks may have based on our answers to those questions or responses to those questions.
Okay. All right. Very good. OPC, since these were your questions, I imagine you guys will probably have a bulk of the questions for Chris.
I can jump on. So Emily Levin supporting OPC. I will note, I think OPC is going to have some comments to share on limited income goals, but are still putting the final touches on those. So just wanted to note that we would like to discuss that a little bit later in the meeting. On cost recovery, there's really no change to OPC's fundamental position. We did appreciate the additional information from the utilities. To be honest, we haven't had a chance to fully review all the data tables yet, so would benefit from a little bit more time. Hang on, I'm just looking for I was actually wondering, Chris, if you could take a moment to just state the utilities position, just to make sure we're clear on that. It seemed from what I took from your comments, you did do some additional modeling of pay down scenarios, but weren't actually proposing those. You still support the status quo approach, but are open to a PIM, but then that PIM wouldn't be phased in until a little later. So I think it would just be helpful if you could sort of state what the actual position is of the utilities to make sure that I've interpreted that correctly and everybody understands whether it has changed from what you originally presented. Would that work?
Sure, and good morning, Emily. And I'll also ask the other utility representatives at the close of my summary if you want to elaborate on anything that I said or clarify anything that I'm about to say. You're more than welcome to jump in as well. But I'll in part take, I guess, start out by saying that I'll start out with the cost recovery component and then jump over to PIM. And that sort of aligns also with the fact that the utilities continue to believe that these are two separate components. As you got from our submittal as well, our responses is that the utilities continue to support the status quo in terms of the cost recovery approach with full allowable rate of return regarding that cost recovery. We continue to support the status quo, which is the 5-year amortization. And you know, there was a lot of internal discussion, among the utilities regarding different types of scenarios, conceptually different types of scenarios. But we continue to come down to, from the customer perspective, any significant change in the amortization period, or even taking the unamortized portion up to a date specific, and generally we've been talking through 2023, taking that and putting it into a different bucket while responsive to the commission. That's why we provided that other sample scenario, just to show the impact. You still have a significant impact on the customer and their what they're paying in their surcharge. And I think we all agree as well that there is, and we've continued to state this as well, that there's a continued level of uncertainty around what GHG abatement will entail in terms of achieving some type of future agreed upon goal, and certainly acknowledging that there's been a great deal of work developing a construct around the goal, but there's a great deal of uncertainty and likely that expenses would be higher than what they are today to achieve those. And so we continue from a cost recovery standpoint, continue to go back to the status quo in terms of aligning the typical measure life of what we see in Empower Maryland today in the portfolio, and making sure we're sensitive that customers are investing in those measures and that they are seeing a return somewhat commensurate. You know, I will say that we know that I think roughly Empower Maryland measure life is about 7 years on average, and you know, we're amortizing over 5 years. But again, you know, as we've stated before too, it's a very difficult balance between having the customer pay that surcharge and getting back what they are investing in. So that's generally the cost recovery element. The PIM element, we again had a lot of discussion, and we think it's best for Maryland, given we're Empower Maryland and PIMS will be new, is perhaps we try 2 different alternatives. The first being what was already proposed and discussed in this forum and also written about, which is the shared savings PIM. And then the other one is new to Exelon, and what we're proposing there is really linking what we're thinking about with the MYP. And I'm not prepared to answer any questions on the MYP at this point because I'm not a subject matter expert in that. However, we are proposing PIMs associated with that, and it in terms of aligning with that and advocating for that, we wanted to give PIMs a try in the Empower Maryland realm as well. To reiterate, not beginning that PIM proposal or a PIM implementation any earlier than 2026, going back to the uncertainty of trying to meet the goal, but then 50 basis points on our rate of return upside and downside if we meet that 110% or higher, or anything less than 90% lower, have a 50 basis points reduction on our return, and to be clear on future program expenses. So I guess I'll pause there and also just ask any of the other utility members if they want to elaborate or clarify anything I said, and then I can answer any follow-up questions as well.
One follow-up question. So in terms of PIM, so the utilities are open to 2 options then, the shared savings proposal that you put forth previously, or this rate of return adjustment. And you said MY, what does that stand for? I just wanted to make sure I caught that.
I'm sorry, yeah, too many acronyms. Multi-year plan.
Okay.
So it's our rate making approach that we're in right now with BGE specifically at PHI as part
So
of it
would
as well.
that would the rate of return adjustment approach require incorporating that into your multi-year rate plan?
If I understand your question, it would not be part of the rate plan, the MYP. It would be part of Empower, and any associated bonus or penalty would be implemented within the Empower Maryland construct and within the surcharge.
Okay. And just one more question, then I see that Tunde has a question as well, and others. For the shared savings PIM, if that were to move forward, are the utilities also suggesting that that would start no earlier than 2026? Okay. Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there for now.
All right, thank you, ma'am. We'll go Babatunde and then Becca.
Thank you, Anna. This is Babatunde Idrisi from MEA. Chris, is there anyone from the utility side that can give us like an overview of what WMP, how that works?
Good morning, Babatunde. I'm sorry, are you referring to MYP?
MYP,
The
yeah, sorry.
multi-year plan? You know, I'm definitely not an expert. I would open it up to anyone that represents the utility to offer a review of that, or we could certainly follow up with some more detail if need be, if no one's on the line, but I would open it up to anyone else that wants to provide an overview. Yeah, it sounds like there's no subject matter expert on the phone in this forum, but perhaps Babatunde, if you have specific questions, we can certainly put you in contact with someone that can help you.
Okay, thank you.
Becca.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify something. So while there are two PIMs proposed into what the utility is set around, it's important to note that the MYP that Exelon is mentioning, that picture is not the same for Potomac Edison. So Potomac Edison believes the proposal of the shared savings that we've referenced previously in the cost recovery working group report, we believe that still stands. We don't have the MYP, so the other proposal on that, I wouldn't say makes sense for us. So I just wanted to make that clear.
All right, thank you, ma'am. I figured that might be the line of demarcation between the companies there. All right, anybody else have any questions for Chris or the utilities? Go ahead, Jim.
Good morning, Chris and everyone. Jim Gravatt on behalf of the Maryland Energy Efficiency Advocates. So I just want to confirm the joint utilities position is they should continue to earn a pretty healthy return on the Empower investments and get performance incentive on top of that.
Well, to reiterate what's written in the document, and good morning, Jim.
Thanks, Chris.
That we've got two different proposals regarding the PIM that are stated in there, and yes, we do believe that this leverages the long history of Empower, and we believe that this ultimately reinforces the commitment that we all have to achieve these future goals in the coming years that we likely believe will be even more difficult to achieve. We are 100% behind Maryland's energy policy and achieving and/or exceeding, if possible. Again, we don't know specifically what the goals are, but we believe that a structure of either one of these PIMs could support that approach.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Although, the phasing in, the fact that the utilities are not proposing to start it until 2026 would mean that in practice, it might not be a PIM on top of the current cost recovery approach for a while yet. Just that's a clarifying point. But yes, I agree. I mean, I think what Jim is driving at, and Nicole, if you're on and prepared to weigh in, I think it could be useful for OPC to share its position, but I think we're arriving at a fairly fundamental disagreement on cost recovery that will just have to be documented, I suppose, as in the final report for this group. It doesn't seem to me that a lot of, while the further analysis is helpful, nobody is really shifting their position. I don't know if others agree with that observation, or I see Jim raising his hand, so maybe he does disagree. I'll stop talking now.
Not at all, Jim Gravatt on behalf of the Energy Efficiency Advocates. I agree, and I'm sure you all noticed that there was this moment where it looked like I was going to say something, and then I didn't, and I couldn't really think of anything polite to say. So that's why I didn't. It is distressing to me to consider increasing the costs, and I understand the utilities proposal that. It's distressing to me, the idea of increasing the earnings for the utilities based on achieving the goals at a lower cost, because I honestly, I think that's your obligation as it is. I truly do. The suggestion that you might try harder to achieve the goals at lower costs if you were paid more to do so is just, and I'm speaking as an individual who pays utility bills, not on behalf of the efficiency advocates, it's quite disturbing to me. I can only imagine how lower income families would feel about the idea that more of their bill was going to shareholders' pockets. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right. Nicole.
Good morning, Your Honor. Nicole Zeitner on behalf of OPC. And I'll lower my hand, I'm sorry. So we would reiterate our position. We most definitely do not believe that a PIM should be added unless the balance, or without the balance being paid down. We would stick with our original proposal. We believe that it's critical to pay down the outstanding balance and transition to expensing. We're open to different approaches to a transition from the status quo amortization to expensing, but over a period of no more than 10 years. And we do believe it's best practice to link utility earnings to performance. And we've seen that with more successful states, and most states, in fact, that on the higher end of the ACEEE chart do that. And I guess I would echo a bit, if the utilities are suggesting that they need these high earnings to be successful, it's just not consistent with other jurisdictions. And we don't believe that that level of earnings is needed to reach the same goals, because other jurisdictions have shown that that's not necessary. And there is one point in which we would be willing to agree here. We understand that the utilities have expressed some concern with the 3-part PIM metric that we proposed, since there is an overall goal shift to greenhouse gas abatement. So we would support a single performance target based on GHG abatement for a PIM that is phased in during the 2024 to 2026 cycle. And maybe this would alleviate some of the utilities' concerns. And if that would change the utilities' position, we would like to know. But we think that that is fair, because that is our new goal structure. But as to our original principles, they would stay the same. And we certainly do not believe that any additional money should be added on top of what is already being paid for the unamortized balance. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nicole. Any initial reactions to that, Chris, or anyone from the utilities?
Yes, Judge, just briefly, and good morning, Nicole. Thanks for your comments. And as we've stated in the written responses and other comments that we've provided in this forum, certainly a more simplistic goal tied to PIM, I think. And let me just preface my statement with, I'm not speaking on behalf of all the utilities, but just speaking in I guess, general terms, is that we would be more comfortable with a single goal that we can all agree upon specifically. And what we've offered up is that the development of that goal be done in parallel with a PIM construct that could certainly mirror what we've talked about already, the 2 proposals that we've talked about. But I think, Exelon had one particular approach, and PE and WGL, not speaking for them specifically, certainly, but having a different approach. But I think the important thing is, whatever goal we achieve, it's something that we can agree upon. It's clear what we are accomplishing. We do have hesitancy around that weighting idea of having a multi-layered potential goal. So I appreciate OPC's position that perhaps you would be willing to move to more of a singular goal. We would be there with you. The other concern, though, too, is just, again, so much change leading up to the next program cycle. We want to achieve, and you know, everyone wants to achieve any goal that puts that is put before them, and better still exceed that goal. But it's just we don't know enough about it to make a significant commitment prior to 2026 at this time.
Thank you, sir. Emily, you had your hand up, ma'am.
Yes, thank you. I only wanted to offer a clarification that OPC is willing to support kind of orienting to the extent that a PIM is not layered on top of the current scheme, and we could get to that point, and there is a PIM, is open to organizing it around greenhouse gas reduction in alignment with the overall framework. I just wanted to note, and I think everybody knows this, that the sort of consensus proposal included some buildup to that greenhouse gas target. So there were components for behind the meter contribution and limited income contribution that all sort of rolled up to an overarching greenhouse gas target. And I just think that's worth noting, because our assumption is that those pieces would remain in place, and the, you know, any performance incentive would be tied to the overall greenhouse gas target, but all those various contributions would still be tracked, and there would be some minimum requirements around the components, you know, where the greenhouse gas abatement comes from. So that's just a bit of a clarification. It doesn't change the position stated by Nicole, but I just wanted to remind everyone that the goal structure had a little bit more definition to it beyond that top level number.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Anybody else? This obviously does. Yes, Dan.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Dan Hurley on behalf of the commission staff. I guess my comments go towards, you know, the proposal for the shared savings PIM is, you know, I think we kind of made that clear in past meetings that we really would not support that kind of shared savings on top of the status quo. We have concerns with PIMs, as we said in the past, with potential increasing costs, increasing evaluation, increasing, you know, just overall increasing time and increasing costs to the programs. I think we've been kind of trying to look at other PIMs in other states to kind of determine, you know, the quote unquote success of those PIMs. You know, maybe they hit a goal, but are they hitting the goal because of the PIM? You know, in our current structure, we've been hitting our goals without a PIM. And then, you know, if we continue on that, hitting goals without the PIM, then any kind of, you know, shortfall of the budget all goes back to the customer. So I don't know why we'd want to kind of change that to take some of that and give it to the utility if they're making the goal anyways. I'm not sure what the incentive is to make more goal. I mean, understanding fully that we are, you know, seeing changes to what the goal structure is going to be. I think also as we're moving forward with the change of goal structure, we're looking at changes of Empower. You know, I think this is the time to really kind of think about how we want to make these other changes. I'm not sure. I think Chris might have mentioned not too many changes at one time, but I think this might be the time to really move into a direction of how we want to recover the cost. And I guess my question for Chris is, I guess with the current status quo 5-year amortization, it's not really addressing the commission's concern with the large unamortized balance. So it's wondering what your thoughts were about that growing unamortized balance are. Thanks.
Good morning, Dan, and thanks for your questions or question. No particular position other than we did provide that other scenario that we think does address the commission's concern. It's unendorsed by the utilities. We hear the commission loudly. It kind of goes back to really what we've been talking about for the last number of weeks on this forum, within this forum and within the utilities. It's really difficult to try to hit all the marks without something being challenged or underrepresented, a particular aspect of cost recovery or PIM being vastly underrepresented or overrepresented. We just didn't find the right mix other than really the status quo, which supports our past successes as a state, and we believe that positions us as well to support future successes, especially in light of the future changes, of more aggressive goals, a different type of goal. All of those elements combined, and most importantly, the customer. We just continue to look at what impact are we going to potentially have on the customer in light of other market conditions going on right now, future expectations of achieving and/or spend, and we came down to the status quo seems to make the most sense.
All right, thanks. Thank you for that, sir. Becca, then Babatunde.
Hi, thank you, Becca Harder, Potomac Edison. Dan, thank you for the comments that you made, and I just wanted to make sure that I called out. We've heard the staff's concerns regarding, a shared savings approach, PIM. We just wanted to reiterate, with the transition to GHG abatement targets and with the uncertainty around the rigor of the new goal parameters, there's a lot of risk on the utilities. And I don't think that we could just look to, well, we've always met our goals and think that that's easily going to occur going forward. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. That's why the utilities are where they are. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Babatunde.
Thank you, Anna. This is Babatunde Idrisu from MEA. I just wanted to state that MEA is supportive of OPC's proposal. I also believes that the PIMs should be based on performance and the future goal structure. We're concerned about increasing the unamortized balance. We're also willing to consider the design of PIMs based on a single goal, such as GHG abatement, if that allows the group to move towards a consensus or an agreed position.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there's not going to be consensus on this particular issue. Yes, Joe.
Good morning, Joe Loper. I just wanted to note, and this goes to Chris's point of tension between all these different elements, that I believe there's been a decision to include of the work group with the joint utility OPC agreement, a decision to count the profits or return in the cost effectiveness analysis, which is something we have not done in the past. And if I understood correctly, and Dylan was correct, and he was right, I have not checked this, but I think Dylan said that the profits were roughly 20% of the costs. Maybe I got that wrong, but based on that, I think it's a pretty straight, or it will significantly affect the cost effectiveness of the programs. And the res sector, currently we have the commission wants to see sector level cost effectiveness, at least for the residential sectors for several of the utilities. The cost effectiveness for the res sector in 2020 was less than 1 or very close to 1. And so if I just went in and changed just that one factor, you're going to have some challenges with cost effectiveness, and that doesn't include the challenges that are going to be coming along with the lighting programs, savings diminishing as a percentage of the portfolio. And so I don't know what that said, I don't know what the conclusion is. I think it points to more challenges in terms of putting together a cost-effective portfolio. It also points to that the return, the current structure, to the extent that it's excessive, as is being asserted, could inhibit or restrict the ability to develop cost-effective portfolios.
All right. Thank you, sir. Any responses to Joe's comments? Yes, Brian.
Yes, good morning, Your Honor. Brian Talley for Delmarva Power and Pepco. Question for Joe, just response. I want to make sure I heard him correctly, is that I thought he said he was quoting someone else on the profits as percent of total program costs. I just want to make sure I heard him correctly.
Yeah. Hi, Brian. Dylan Voorhees, I believe in a few meetings ago, said calculations to figure out how much the 5-year amortization return is as a percent of the total program spend. And I may be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure he said it was 20%. And so that's what I'm keying off of. If it's 10%, it's still matters. It's matters less, but if it's 30 or something, then it matters more. But
yeah, that number just seems high. That's all. I don't think it, unless Dylan can chime in here, but I don't know if the other utility, I think it's not, it's basically the weighted average cost of capital you're losing and some percent, depending on the number of credits you have run through that calculation.
Well, I think it was, I think basically he's taking, the 8 or 9% of 100% of the spend in the first year, then 80% in the second year. That would be my guess. And then 60% in the third year, 40%, something like that. And that's probably the math on it, but looks like Emily can maybe be able to inform us.
Yeah, that's right. And Dylan conveniently is on vacation. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Yeah, Dylan is on vacation, so unfortunately he's not able to respond directly, but the analysis that we did with OPC, it was the combination of the return on equity, the rate of return, plus the return associated with the outstanding balance that is just sort of carried along, the total sum of which added up to around 20% of the amount that the utilities are earning on those two components represented about 20% of the total program spending in a certain year. I understand that's not the way the utilities typically look at it, but that was what we believe to be true based on the analysis we did. I'm trying to dig up a reference to that right now. And I think there was some discussion of that at a prior meeting, and prepared to go into the weeds on exactly how he did that analysis, but I think this work group, asked a number of questions about that at the meeting where this was discussed.
Nicole, you want to jump in?
I apologize. I raised my hand too early. I thought I had the document up. If you could just give me 1 minute, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
No problem. Take your time. Joe.
Yeah, I'm comparing, by the way, that 20% to if you didn't count any profit in the cost effectiveness analysis. Of course, the utility, I don't expect that the final solution here would ever be that the utilities don't get any return on their energy efficiency programs. And so when we're counting those profits, if the profits went down, then it's not going to be a full 20% difference is what I'm saying. So let's say it's 8%, ends up being 8% or 10%, whatever it is, then that's the delta. So I'm just pointing out that currently we don't include profits at all. We assume it's zero. If 20% is really the right answer, then it is material for cost effectiveness. And that affects kind of everybody in all directions creates challenges, which, I like to do. I like to cause problems for everybody.
All right, Andrew.
Hi, this is Andrew Lawson from Washington Gas. I'm with Brian, and this is why I asked all these questions of Dylan at that last meeting. I think the 20% is way too high. I think it's probably closer to 10, even under that scenario where you count the lifetime return on a year spend. One thing folks also need to remember is that your revenue requirement or your return is calculated net of deferred taxes, so that lowers your kind of base even further. So it's not quite as large as it might seem at first glance. So just a little background.
All right, thank you, sir.
And I'm sorry, one more thing, Judge.
Yeah,
I believe I had asked Dylan to provide that analysis, and although he seemed reluctant to do it, I thought he agreed he would. So I don't think I've seen it yet.
All right, maybe we can get an answer for you on that. We'll go Ken and then Joe.
Hi, this is Ken over at PE, and I just am not sure I understand the logic behind this. I do have a background in rates, and when I think about EE investment, I think it would be the same as T&D investment. So, our return would be closer to 9% or somewhere between 8 and 9, probably. That's all.
Thank you, sir. All right, Joe.
Yeah, I have not seen Dylan's spreadsheet, but I think the math, let me tell you what I suspect the math is and why I haven't argued with it, is basically that the assumption is that the energy efficiency could be expensed. I think that's what's being proposed by others. And so if you did that, then you don't have this unamortized balance hanging out there for 5 years. And in terms of having that, so if that's what I think is the baseline that Dylan is using. And so if the math on, let's say it's even 5% return, then the math on that is 5% first year, 4% the second year, 3% the third year, 2% the fourth year, and 0%, 1% or something the last year. So you're already, even at 5% weighted average cost of capital, that math to me is, 5 plus 4 plus 3 is 12 plus 2 is, 14. So if we're talking 8 or 9% weighted average cost of capital, then I could easily see it being, in fact, much higher, significantly higher than 20%. If we were talking 9%, which is I think what Ken just said, then I think, or let's use round numbers, use 10%, then you're talking 10, 8, 6, 4, 2. And that far exceeds 20%. So I think that's the math probably. And if that math is somehow incorrect in this context, given what people are talking about, then feel free to dismiss it. But I have not heard reason to dismiss it yet.
All right. Thank you, sir. Nicole, any luck?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. I was just going to confirm that is the analysis that we completed or that VEIC completed on our behalf. And I was just going to show our comments again that had the chart where that 20% and sometimes in more than 20% was displayed, but that does not help with the spreadsheet. So I'm just checking my email to make sure he didn't maybe send them to me and I neglected to circulate them. So I'm checking now, but I'll just briefly.
Nicole, I found the email from, there's an email on February 24th, where you sent, it's recirculated for PIM and cost recovery work groups. So I'm assuming that this also went to the future programming work groups, but it has the worksheet attached as well as the comments. So I think everyone should have had that and been able to see where the numbers came from.
Thank you. And I'll just briefly, if it's helpful, share my screen and just display the image that this is where we were getting the 20%, but maybe people already have that. Let's see. this is, and Joe is correct that some earnings are over 20%, some are right around 20%, and some are a little less, but they're still significantly higher than these top jurisdictions. I mean, if you look at Vermont, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, their earnings would appear to be out of proportion with what is necessary to achieve good results. And that was our concern. And this is in our comments on cost recovery and performance incentives from February 14th. And I don't know if people want to look at the spreadsheet. I can recirculate that if that's helpful.
Sure, doesn't hurt.
All right, thank you.
All right. Anybody else want to weigh in? All right. I think we kind of know where everyone stands on this. All right. Let's go back and go to the Cadmus low income analysis that we briefly talked about the last couple of weeks. And I know Jim had submitted some comments on Tuesday. I believe he did. Tuesday or yesterday, or it's escaping me right now. Jim, did you want to take any, or you want to give an overview of those, or you just want to take comments or question Dr. Kowalczyk some more?
Well, I'll just make a brief statement then, if I may. Jim Gravatt on behalf of the Energy Efficiency Advocates, and much gratitude to Sammy Khwaja and DHCD for taking a look at the data, providing the data for us to consider. And for context, I have a couple of times in this process raised the concern that low-income customers are not affected by Empower, by the surcharge, and by potentially by the benefits they receive sort of equitably across utility territories. That if we try to reach all customers, all income eligible customers at the same rate, for example, some of them might pay more than others, and that there's some risk of kind of a regressive setup where income eligible, low income, energy burdened customers are paying, let's say they're paying too much into the Empower costs. And this was all super hypothetical. I didn't have any data. I didn't know, but I was concerned about it. And so Sammy provided some data and did a look at it. And in my view, what it confirms is that there are potentially issues. We don't know enough to know yet. When we looked at what we looked at, one of the things that's in the comments that I circulated, we looked at the average pre-program electricity use of DHCD's participants over the last, I'm not sure how many years, 5 to 10 years. And the amount of electricity that these customers use in different utility territories varies quite a bit. The amount of the surcharge per kilowatt hour varies quite a bit across utilities. And when you look at that average use times the surcharge, and I used what was estimated for 2022 in the utilities 2021 to 23 plans, you see a range of, on those average customers, if that's representative of all of the low-income customers in each utility territory, which we don't know, but if it were, then the range of what they're paying on their bills could be between like $60 and $150, depending on what utility they're served by. That seems like a really, really big gap to me. And, if all of the customers, if all of the income eligible customers were being provided program services within, let's even say within a 3-year period, that would be a different situation, although I'm not sure what what it would mean, than now, where we're putting the legislation that passed aside for a minute, where maybe, I think Sammy said maybe 10,000 customers a year are being served by DHCD. That means there's several hundreds of thousands of income eligible customers who are not, and they're paying a fair amount of money on their bills towards Empower. I think there are so many questions that this little look at the data raises. And, I think I think it'd be very risky for us to try to make a recommendation based on this quick look in the time frame that we're in. So my suggestion is that a third-party study is really warranted here, looking at the impact of the surcharge and the programs on income-eligible customers. And that I think that that's something that the commission could commission to be done. I think the legislature could look at that. I know there's been some interest in the legislature about the impacts of the surcharge on lower income customers. I think potentially this could be within the purview of the Office of People's Counsel to consider. But I think my view is somebody should do a study, and this should really be dug into, and that there may be some kind of sweeping policy changes that would be appropriate.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Qualja, morning.
Good morning to you. Sorry I was late. It turned out difficult to find a parking lot I could pull into. And
No problem, sir.
So first of all, let me say, personally, and this is not on behalf of DHCD, I'm in complete agreement with what Jim said. And the reality is that we are charging some 600,000 customers a surcharge for the benefit of maybe 10,000. I have done further analysis since Jim sent his numbers, and I looked at the impact on energy burden. And these numbers are not exact, but we're raising the energy burden of the low-income population, the non-participants, the non-DHCD customers, by 2 to 4%, to lower the energy burden of some 10,000 customers by 15 to 20%. I'm all for weatherization. It's a great thing, and we need to do it. It's a long-term solution. It does lower the energy burden for these customers for their life for a long period of time. So it's a good thing to do. But one does have to question if energy burden is our concern, and we have said multiple times in this group that energy burden is a big concern, then we really should be thinking seriously about raising the energy burden of such a large population by 2 to 4% is a pretty significant increase in energy burden, and it needs to be addressed. And it's probably not within the purview of this group, but it has to be addressed. And there's just a finite number of ways that it can be addressed, either through rates or through financial assistance or some sort of help. But it in my opinion, I think that Jim is right on. We really cannot just ignore that problem. It is a very serious problem.
All right. Thank you, sir. And again, appreciate all your work on this. All right. Anybody else want to weigh in? Nicole, I think OPC had indicated it wanted to weigh in on this topic.
Yes. And first, we don't oppose a study. We're not sure if we really would need to think further about whether we're the entity to do that, or whether it should be a larger study involving other agencies or entities or independent organizations. But we don't oppose this, and we are also concerned. And we have another proposal for limited income customers, but I don't want to interrupt, and we can finish the conversation here, and then I could present that later if you would like.
Anybody else want to comment on anything Jim or Dr. Qualja has said?
I just may add, sorry, just very quickly. I think the study's objectives, in my opinion, we're 70% of the way there already. We already know what the problem is. We already know the impact of the problem, and adding additional precision beyond that is helpful, but we're almost there. This is not a huge lift.
All right. I'm sure OPC will, with that said, I'm sure OPC will be happy to take it. All right. Anybody else like the idea of a study? Don't like it? Don't think it's an issue? Yes, Nicola.
Hi, I just wanted to bring up to the group, I'm sure a lot of parties here are aware of the limited income energy savings goal bill that is currently passing through the legislature, and that was already passed by the House and the Senate. And it appears it's very likely to go into effect. So I just wanted to raise that again while we're looking at limited income goals that are set through the Empower program, to ensure that those don't contradict the goals that are going to be mandated through legislation. And I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, Emily.
Thank you. I just wanted to note, and we can touch on this more when OPC presents our additional comments on limited income goals and some additional analysis we've done. But with respect to this question of additional study, I don't know that OPC takes a position on whether additional study on this particular issue of the surcharge impact is needed. But I wanted to note that there are a bunch of issues that would seem to require some further discussion and or analysis related to kind of the share of responsibility between the utilities and OPC, and some, geographic equity kinds of issues. So we can talk about that more when we present our comments, but I guess I just wanted to note that it appears to us that there are a few areas that would likely require some further attention related to limited income goal setting and budgets beyond what we'll be able to resolve at this meeting today.
All right.
If I can respond to Ms. Levin briefly, I completely agree, and also agree, of course, with Sammy that there's a pretty clear picture emerging. I think where it gets complicated is looking at it more broadly, because I think this solution isn't obvious, especially in light of the legislation. Well, some solutions are obvious, but they're challenging. They're going to require a challenging policy process to address. So if we're looking at rate structures or percent of income payment plans or a statewide approach to Empower for income eligible households instead of utility by utility, those are kind of challenging policies, I think, to get in place. And my hope in raising this is that there's some, that the importance of these issues is at least mentioned in the report and brought to the Commission's attention, because nothing's going to happen unless we start doing something. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And to the extent I miss it in the report, or Judge Burke and I miss it in the report, feel free to edit as you see fit to emphasize that, sir. But we will definitely endeavor to get that done, sir.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Anybody else? Yes, Scott.
Good morning. So Scott Falvey, DHCD. So I think it was maybe 2 meetings back or so, Jim, you had thrown out there that maybe you could be on board with the limited income goal being specifically DHCD's goal. I'm wondering if you still feel that way, and then kind of to add to that, to add to what Nicola had mentioned, if this legislation passes, the legislation requires, or the legislation sets the limited income goal on DHCD, and would we then want the utilities to be responsible at all for limited income savings outside of supporting DHCD to get to those customers?
Well, Scott, I think you've nailed it exactly. I mean, if this legislation is going to become law, which seems pretty likely, then it doesn't really matter what I think. I mean, it's DHCD's responsibility and to meet the goals. And but personally, of course, I'd be very open to different ways that DHCD might find to achieve the goals. And I don't see why it would be off the table for DHCD to work with utilities to, achieve some savings that could be attributed towards the goal. It's just it's a conversation that could be had. Sure.
Right. But do you or anybody else on the meeting here see that legislation maybe overriding or removing the commission's interest in the utilities achieving low-income savings as well?
Well, let's see. If I were on the stand, I'd say, well, that calls for speculation, and I'm not sure I would want to answer that question. But I have to believe that if this becomes law, the commission is probably going to say, okay, well, that's what it is. We just have to, we have a role in making sure that DHCD complies with the law.
And to your point, all this is speculation. It has passed the legislation. It doesn't mean it'll become law, but it's gotten farther than it has in the past, and quite quickly also. And so that, the department does feel that there's a really good chance that this will actually come into play this year.
I agree.
And that will require us to do a whole lot of modification and submit a new plans in September. So.
All right. Julia.
Thank you, Your Honor. Julia Friedman with O-Power. This is just a little bit tangential, but wanted to go back to something that Dr. Kawaja said earlier, making the point that we need to have something for all these other customers. And I know that the utilities do. And I think it's an opportunity to make the relationship between what's offered in the way of energy assistance and the role of energy efficiency to lower bills, in a different way. This is a real opportunity just to make that connection between those two types of offerings much stronger. And so, hopefully that's something as we go forward, we can see as well. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, Doc.
If I may just offer a translation for you all for what this legislation means. A 1% reduction of all customers under the 250% of federal poverty translates to 35,000 traditional weatherization participants a year. And we are doing 5,000 to 8,000 a year. So significantly different museum.
I don't know if it was just me or did everybody get that?
He stumbled a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. In the middle, Dr. Kawaja, you kind of broke up, sir, after 35 additional participants per year.
I am so sorry. I think it's the parking structure and the connectivity. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, sir.
All right. So a 1% reduction translates to 35,000 participants a year in the traditional weatherization program. It's not doable because we have in the last 10 years done 5,000 to 8,000 customers a year. So something significantly, radically different is needed. So I'm in agreement with what Julia just said, and we need something different. And it has to be, a radical change in the way we approach this energy burden problem.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that. Emily.
I just wanted to suggest that perhaps OPC should present its comments because we have done some additional analysis as well, kind of along the lines of what Sammy just said of kind of the scale of additional impact. And our analysis maybe focuses a little bit more on spending than participation, but I think it could be a useful input for this conversation. So I just wanted to suggest that this might be a good time to, if Nicole is ready, have her share OPC's comments.
Sure. Is everybody, I don't want to say done with Dr. Kawaja for now? Maybe don't go anywhere. Maybe you have some comments on OPC. All right, if OPC is ready, go ahead.
Right. Good morning. Nicole Zeichner on behalf of OPC. So in conjunction with VEIC, we have done some calculations on different scenarios that would increase equity among low income or limited income customers. And Emily's going to go through some of this, and then I'm going to explain further. I'll just share my screen. And this was, and I apologize, this was just sent to the work group maybe about half an hour ago. So I don't expect anyone to have been able to have reviewed this. So we've already discussed cost recovery. And Emily was just going to go through some of these. I apologize. Actually, there we go. Emily is just going to go through some of this.
Yeah, so what we ended up doing was modeling a couple of different scenarios just to kind of assess through a few different lenses how equitable the current Empower programs are and what sort of scale of additional investment would be needed to achieve different structures that would move the program more towards an equitable approach. I want to acknowledge a couple of caveats up front. One is we took a couple of sort of simplified lenses on, equity. There are a lot of other approaches one could take around the number of participants reached or addressing energy burden. And so we're not suggesting that these scenarios are the be all and end all. They just are one sort of indicator that can provide some illustrative indication of sort of how far Empower may need to go. I also want to caveat that we did this analysis based on the budgets and savings targets that were in the 2021 through 2023 plan. So it's not based on actuals. It doesn't represent shifting to greenhouse gas reduction. So all of this is just very illustrative and should be interpreted in that light. But we were considering a few different elements of equity. So these numbers that are in bold here, limited income households based on 250% of federal poverty level, there are 26.5% of these households in Maryland, but only 17% of current residential program spending is for limited income. And if you look just at savings, then it's even more imbalanced, where DHCD savings represent only 3% of total program life cycle savings. So those sort of lenses of how equitable are the programs based on the spending and how equitable are they based on the savings are some of the scenarios we looked into. We also modeled the scenario for 0.4% annual savings as a percentage of retail sales, which is included in the legislation that Nicola and Scott mentioned, because that does seem like it could become a very active part of the discussion really quickly. So we thought that would be useful to assess as well. So if you scroll down a little bit, Nicole, as sort of a starting point, in theory, it sounds wonderful to be able to achieve an equitable level of savings such that the proportion of savings going to, and we did this based on life cycle savings, the proportion of life cycle savings for limited income households would be sort of similar to their share of the population. But when you run those numbers, if you scroll down to the top of the next page, that is a huge additional increase in spending. So over a 3-year period, say for the 2021 through 23 period that we're in now, just again as an illustration, achieving savings proportionality according to sort of some of the assumptions we made and the numbers used here, Empower would be looking at a $775 million increase in limited income spending. So that's a huge increase, and we recognize likely not an achievable increase, nor an increase that could be effectively managed. It would be important to OPC that any increases are phased in at a pace that can be effectively deployed in terms of the workforce and the program infrastructure and all of that. So we looked at a couple of other scenarios that are a little bit more modest. So scenario one would bring the Empower programs to a more proportional level of savings in which each the amount of limited income funding in each utility's service territory is in proportion to the percentage of limited income households in each utility service territory. So for some utilities like Pepco, that would require only a pretty small increase. The proportion of spending is fairly proportional, it seemed to us in Pepco's territory, just taking that as an example. But for other utilities like Potomac Edison or SMECO, it would require quite large increases. So in that scenario, Empower would be looking at needing to spend an additional about $41 million over a 3-year period for limited income. So that was one scenario. And then another scenario we looked at was around the legislation, the limited income savings target of 0.4%. If you scroll down to the table, Nicole, under this scenario, it kind of the impact comes out a little bit differently in utility service territories. So this might be interesting to compare kind of the impact on different utilities in scenario 1 versus scenario 2. So for example, in this scenario, BG&E is actually already achieving this target based on the numbers, again, in the last triennial plan, whereas other utilities would have to do much more. Overall, we were looking at an increase of about $63 million in spending. So this would require more across the state than scenario 1 spending proportionality, but not nearly as much as savings proportionality, which again, we were looking at $775 million of additional spending. Again, I reiterate, this is all illustrative. None of this is oriented towards greenhouse gas reduction. This is all based on forecast data from the last plan. I'm sure we could quibble with the method or some of the numbers used, but we thought this might be useful to just illustrate kind of, I guess, a couple of overarching points. One, by really any measure, the current level of limited income spending, at least if we're only counting the DHCD spending, is not in proportion to what could be a base floor level of equity. So, I think OPC is pretty convinced that something needs to be done. But number 2, we're looking at pretty substantial increases in spending, not to mention, as Sammy noted, increases in participation and potentially program design to achieve wider reach to achieve these goals. So a couple of big picture notes kind of based on this analysis, and this is where I think OPC really arrived at feeling like more discussion is going to be needed. And even in the scenario where this new legislation does pass, we're open to different, we're interested in looking at the surcharge impacts, which depend in part on whether you're just reallocating funding within the total Empower budget or increasing the budget, which is, I think, still an open question as we look ahead to a future period. OPC is also interested in further exploring if and how responsibility for these targets should be shared between DHCD and the utilities, feeling like at minimum it will make sense for DHCD to be responsible for a target, but there also could be some important roles for utilities to play. And as a baseline, OPC believes that the utilities should be more consistently tracking and reporting their limited income work, and that might be through the evaluation process. But at a bare minimum, we would like to get better insight on how the more mass market efforts of the utilities are impacting limited income customers, and whether that might be a strategy to mitigate some of the non-participant impacts that Sammy mentioned and Julia discussed. And then again, the ramp up period, just knowing that any significant increase in program spending requires some time to do it well. And then the last note that I wanted to make is a little bit around the electrification piece, just noting that new legislation is based on electricity savings as a percentage of retail electricity sales. And that does present some potential complications as we collectively look towards shifting to more of a greenhouse gas based approach, and in particular, what the impact of fuel switching would be, and if, would DHCD then not be incentivized to support electrification. So that's another area that's probably going to need some further exploration and discussion if that does pass, or if this group were to decide to set a goal that's based on savings. It actually can make a difference whether that's based on megawatt hour savings or whether that's based on greenhouse gas abatement. I think I'll pause there and see if Nicole would add or modify anything I've said.
Nicole Zeitner on behalf of OPC. That is consistent with our position, and we'd like discussion on this because obviously there are many issues that would have to be worked out, but we really do think that at least the 41 million would be a floor for achieving additional equity for limited income customers. And we also would not tie, if we were to go with this, I believe it's 61 million, which would be consistent with the current pending legislation. We think that this increase needs to happen with or without the legislation. So we would not be tying that specifically to the legislation. If the legislation in the end does not become law, we still support an increase in the limited income budget. So we also, in regards to what Scott and DHCD have proposed with solar, we think that it's worth considering, or at least exploring the possibility of including solar and Empower programs as part of comprehensive electrification projects. And that might require future legislative action, but we do think that's worth considering as well. So we're open to any questions, suggestions, or proposals.
Joe.
Yeah, Emily or Nicole, could you just page up to that last table? I just had a clarifying question. I was a little confused. So the point, there you go. So it's showing a 0.4% savings target. Oh, this is the sum of the 3 years is 63. So isn't the legislation currently 1%?
It's a ramp up, Joe, in the legislation. The 0.4 is for the first year savings.
Yeah. And so once you get to 1%, then basically you got 1.5 times 63. So that would be 150 million increase. Am I interpreting that right?
I think so. And then I think I didn't realize that it ramped up beyond the 0.4%. So I just wasn't up to speed on the latest component of that legislation. So yes, it would be even higher. I did want to note that the legislation, at least the legislation that I reviewed, it's a percentage, savings is a percentage of limited income sales. So we had to kind of back into that by calculating the limited income proportion of sales based on the percentage of the population. Again, this is all sort of illustrative and not take it to the bank, but illustrative of the kind of scale of impact we might be looking at.
And I'll throw out there too. So DHCD had to submit a fiscal note on this to inform legislation on the impact that we saw. And these numbers are actually low based on our estimates. For example, I don't have everything in front of me, but in being required to submit a plan in September, we'd be looking at a roughly $45 million increase for 2023, which is a huge increase, for that 1 year to achieve that 0.4%. That would be for the remainder of this 3-year cycle. But then again, I don't remember the numbers offhand, but for 24, 25, and 26, it's a significant number. we didn't approach it from an equity perspective. We approached it based on, current production and what it would look like going forward. Bringing equity into the picture, it might fluctuate where funding is spent and how much per unit. But more as a reference, DHCD is looking at 45 million increase in 2023 to achieve that 0.4%.
Scott, that's really helpful. Would you be able to share that fiscal note with the group? Is that public?
It should be public. I'm not sure if it should be available on the legislative website as part of the legislation review. I'm not sure where it is beyond that. I'm sure we could track it down internally.
All right, thanks, Scott. Brian and then Joe.
Yes, good morning again, Your Honor. Brian Talley for the PHI Utilities, Pepco, and Delmarva. Just a follow-up question, and I did not have a chance to read it beforehand, and I'm not as familiar with some of the subject, but as kind of the background of cost recovery, if I heard it correctly, it was in the $40 to $63 million spend or somewhere around there. And I was wondering, I think, Emily, you mentioned that you haven't modeled it against potentially a surcharge or otherwise, but just thinking about what your thoughts are around that, especially against a backdrop of potentially, as OPC has represented, going to a pay down or expense mode, and then the GHG goals, kind of how does that all weave together? And think about the customer and the potential increases in surcharges.
Well, I would say, Nicole Zeichner on behalf of OPC, and that's the topic of conversation here, because we could consider redistributing a portion of the utilities budgets to DHCD, and we could also consider a portion of a budget increase. So it does not necessarily all have to come from a budget increase, but we wanted to get input on that because we too, of course, are worried about the surcharge impact. So that's open for discussion, whether there's a way to redistribute some funds to avoid a larger impact, surcharge impact.
And what I would add to that too is that one thing we haven't really modeled, this analysis kind of builds off of DHCD's planned budgets and savings, but we do know that the utility programs do generate some savings that benefit limited income people and might be a way to, if DHCD is going really deep, then the utilities are maybe better equipped to go wide and address some of those potential non-participants in comprehensive weatherization. It remains to be seen whether there would be the kind of flexibility that would even allow this if this legislation is adopted, but potentially, a portion of the responsibility for deploying these budgets and saving, achieving these goals could be done by the utilities, but we don't really know what is currently being happening with the utilities. And so, in general, we would want to make sure that collectively Maryland is going above and beyond what it's currently doing and not just kind of claiming credit for utility activities that are already happening. But we do recognize that the utilities are doing activities that should potentially be counted or could potentially be counted in some way to help achievement of this goal. So again, these are really complicated issues that we just think need some further examination before taking a position.
All right, we got Joe, Scott, and then Dr. Kowalczyk.
Yeah, since Emily's recommending further research, I shouldn't put her on the spot with this question, but is the 1% that's in the current legislation, is that displacing part of the 2%? And in other words, that's a kind of a carve out of the, when I say 2%, I'm just assuming a 2% goal, roughly continues. So I'm not, I don't know that will be the case, but is the 1% displacing part of the 2%? And if it is, has anyone thought about what the math is on that? Because I'm struggling a little bit. I could see it as being 25% if the limited income customers at a 250% poverty line are is 25% of total consumption. I think that's what you said, something like that. You had that number in your document. If that's 25%, then would the math be 25% of Maryland electric consumption needs to be reduced by 1%, and then the remaining 75% of consumption needs to be reduced at 2%? Is that how it would work? That makes sense, Emily? Sorry.
Whether it makes sense might be a bit of a stretch, Joe, but I think I see what you're driving at. And I mean, I guess all I would say is it does seem to me that whatever savings are achieved within limited income households should be counted towards the overall Empower goal if the funding is coming from Empower. The impacts of that, I'm not really prepared to speak to. I mean, I think some of what you just said makes logical sense, but I haven't, I'm not really prepared to respond to the details of that without running the numbers myself.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Scott, you're up.
Hi, Scott Fpwg, DHCD. So I think that's a good question, Joe. And if I follow it correctly, it's something that I had asked, I think, way back early in the beginning of the sessions, is whether if DHCD is doing limited income savings, and yet the utilities have to do a goal against all customers, the utilities essentially are missing out on access to the low income segment in order to be able to capture savings too. So maybe their savings goal is overstated. If that's what you were saying, but that could potentially be, a concern that the utilities might have. So
hey,
Scott,
can I just interject and just
sure.
I'm sorry if you're okay. I actually was wondering whether the math would reduce the burden on the utilities. I could see you doing the math different ways and it going either direction. And that's why I was kind of questioning whether it would, because I could see, rather than having a 2% goal on the 25% of consumption, right? You would have a 1% goal. That's what the limited income. So the limited income consumption has a 1% target, and it's the rest remaining has a 2% target. And that actually, that maybe improve equity. It certainly doesn't make it equitable. But it would, the challenge I think for everybody is going to be meeting more goals and limited income, which is going to raise the cost per kilowatt hour of savings. But if the math is like what I proposed, then I think the utilities are off the hook for 25% of the savings. DHCD goes and does that for limited income. It counts, it costs however much it costs, and then the effective goal for the utilities would conceivably be, one would be 3/4 what it was going to be at 2%. So I'm not clear. I'm just making clear, Scott, that I'm not sure it drives up the burden to the utilities or drives it down, but it matters how you define that.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I don't see anything in the legislation, that identifies that one way or the other. Everything that's in this legislation is related to low income and the responsibility DHCD has to achieving those low income goals. And the proposed legislation doesn't discuss any responsibility of the utilities, towards that low income goal. The other thing I wanted to point out or throw out there is DHCD's responsibility doesn't rely solely on Empower. Through the legislation, there's also a multitude of other funding sources that we have to access or apply federally or whatever to try to achieve this goal. But when we made the fiscal note on the legislation, we were accounting for those known funding sources, expected funding sources such as DOE getting a pretty significant increase over the next several years, and then doing our estimates based on those known funds. we also have to coordinate with other entities, with MEA and CEF funds. All of those other actions towards low income will be counted towards the low income goal. So the responsibility doesn't lay solely on Empower. It really is DHCD's responsibility to identify and utilize other resources to the best of its ability to be incorporated in achieving this goal. But that being said, the fiscal note that we provided was taken into account everything within DHCD's control. It does not account for any other state agencies and funding sources that may also be doing low-income work.
All right, thanks, Scott. Dr. Qualja and then Nicola.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me okay? Okay. While we're talking goal and numbers, Nicole and Emily, I have a concern about, since everything's driven off of use.
We lost you, sir. Everything after is driven by.
Yeah.
All right, we'll come back.
The goal is driven by that usage number, correct?
I believe, I think Sammy is trying to get to the same point as Joe Loper was making. It depends, the baseline is really what matters here, right? And that's also what mattered in the calculation of the goal bill, is what is the baseline of that the 0.4% is taken off, or what's the baseline that the 2% for the utilities is based on. And those are, I think, decisions that have to probably come from the PSC based on opinions in this group of what the baseline is. Should the limited income population be removed from the utilities goal baseline, or should it remain part of it? Currently, the utilities 2% goal includes all customers, and that includes limited income population. But once DHCD becomes responsible for the savings for the limited income population, I guess Joe is making the point, maybe then then that population is no longer the utilities' responsibility, and it should be removed from the baseline that they have to achieve the 2% off, or whatever the goal is going to be.
Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I put my hand down assuming I was called on, and I didn't wait. Thank you. Actually, I think it's specified in statute in both cases what the baseline is and how it's calculated. So it's a legal question, and the commission can review it and decide what discretion they have to consider how the goals work together. But I believe in each case it specifies how the baseline shall be calculated.
That's correct, but the power statute, I guess, did not factor in that there may be another outside goal at some point, so potentially that might be reviewed, right?
I think it would have to be changed in statute, probably. I am not a lawyer, but yeah.
Thank you, sir. Dan, you wanted to jump in, sir?
Yeah, thank you. Dan Hurley with Commission staff. I guess my first comment is wow, because it's a lot of money. I think in the legislation that's pending the governor's signature or veto or whatever goes for the next steps, it definitely calls for the baseline as the average of the 2016 residential customer usage for each utility, and then they have to take that and multiply that by the number of households at below 250% of the poverty line. So the baseline set. I would think that, well, depending on what other metrics we develop for our continuing with Empower on the non-limited income side, I guess if there's still some kind of baseline calculation that, we'd have to subtract that out of the baseline to make sure we're not kind of double goaling here or double counting. Looks like there's a lot of sources for funding for this program, so it's just not it's really not an Empower program anymore. It's a statewide limited income program that is going to leverage Empower to meet those goals. There's federal monies, there's strategic energy investment funds monies. So there's a lot in the bill. And I guess the last thing I noticed in that bill is there's a task force is going to be set up to, I think, outside of our little group here, that's required to be set up to talk about these plans for next year and the coming cycles. There's a lot to unpack there, and I guess we'll unpack it as needed. But
and that task force too, Dan, requires DHCD to get to every single low-income customer in the state by 2030, which is an absolute monstrous lift.
It's just interesting. We're talking about bill impacts and bills and surcharges, and now we're getting bills that are, we're definitely don't know how we're not going to see increase in surcharges with this bill. And obviously all the environmental policies are going to cause bill increases that we're shooting for our environmental policy goals of the state. So it's a lot to unpack. It's just a huge number. I mean, the RPS compliance payments now are up in the $500 million range per year. So those are not on anybody's bill. So it's kind of tied into the bill. So no one really gets to see that impact, but the Empower surcharge kind of slaps you right in the face with, here's you're paying for this much for this Empower. So those are my comments. Thanks for your time on that.
Thanks, Dan. Jim.
Jim Grabbat on behalf of the Energy Advocates. And Dan, I agree with you. There's a lot to unpack in this bill. And clearly the surcharge impacts are going to be large. And I think it makes the discussion we were having earlier about how those affect income eligible households all the more critical to figure out. I mean, I will say the best way is to provide comprehensive savings to every income eligible household. And that's fantastic that this bill is going to advance that. But in the meantime, to get there, the impacts on those households who are in the queue are going to be significant.
Go ahead, Joe.
At the risk of sounding overly cynical, you could reach every participant by sending them all a light bulb, or I don't know that there's any requirements for comprehensive, is there? And I'm not suggesting that should be happening, but I just that on occasion is what does happen. So something to consider in the design.
All right, thank you, sir. Anybody else want to weigh in? Nicole, were you hoping for some kind of further discussion on this? I mean, what's your end game here on what you filed or what?
Yes, Your Honor. I think we would probably, and I'll discuss this with Emily, but I think we might revise our comments to just clarify that bill increases beyond 0.4 fairly quickly. So we might fix that in the table. And then, I mean, yes, this is not an issue that we really could just come up with on our own. We'd like some input, and people have given input. I don't know if there might be support for one of these proposals. That's kind of what we were hoping for, to have a good conversation about it. And we are having a good conversation about it, but I don't know if anyone's really ready, with having just read this, to really provide a lot of input on this.
Right.
And I would just add, it seems like there's also a significant uncertainty / likely scenario in which this legislation passes, and that becomes the guiding force. And so then the conversation becomes how best to implement the legislation and adjust accordingly. So I'm not quite sure what that means for the future programming work group, but just the timing of all of this, there's sort of a lot of moving pieces that make it difficult for parties to take extremely firm positions beyond sort of some of the core principles that we and others have laid out.
Right. Yeah, I don't know that there's going to be time to pivot to what legislation may or may not pass. So at least in this work group. So I think my thought would be we'd file the report and let the commission deal with the legislative changes, and hopefully the parties will have an opportunity to make a presentation, and then maybe amend their positions as they see fit based on that, whatever does ultimately pass. I mean, unless anybody sees it differently.
Yeah, and so just to clarify, and this is in the comments that we circulated in writing this morning, but these scenarios were just fodder for discussion, and the actual positions that OPC are taking are pretty basic. And OPC is taking are pretty basic. There should be some increase in spending to move in the direction of equity. It should be phased in a way that makes sense. We're open to sharing responsibilities between the utilities and DHCD in some fashion. DHCD should have a goal of some kind. We do support modifying legislation if needed to include solar. So, I did just want to note there are some core principles laid out. It might be helpful if other parties could similarly lay out their core principles if they haven't already done so. But my sense is that OPC's core principles are pretty uncontroversial within this group. And so we might be able to achieve some alignment on some of those basic core principle areas while leaving a lot of the major impacts, like what exactly is the goal going to be, who's responsible for it, what is the total budget, how does that impact the surcharge, all those small issues. I think we'll just have to remain somewhat in flux.
All right. Yes, Dan.
Yes, Dan Hurley, Christian staff. Yeah, Chuck, I agree with you on, there's obviously, we don't have the flexibility in this group to react to new laws and legislation. So the commission is going to have to be the ultimate decider on what direction this goes. And like I said, with that bill, this commission tends to follow legislative intent pretty strongly. So if the law says we're going to have a 1% goal for limited income amongst all these other programs, and that's probably what it's going to be, and we'll have to figure out how Empower will play a role in achieving that goal. And I guess I'll note that there is legislation floating around. I think it's got from the Senate to the House that does have increases in the percentage of Empower that were based off the 2%, slowly over time going up to like 2.75%. But I will note that in that legislation, there is at least a recognition that this work group is working towards recommending new goal structures, and will take into consideration what the commission forwards on to the General Assembly as far as the bigger Empower programs go.
All right, thank you, sir. Scott.
Hi, Scott Fpwg, DHCD. So I guess I agree too, and I think what we want to keep in mind again with the report is we're making recommendations to the commission. If this legislation goes through, we're too late to make any changes to this legislation, but it doesn't mean recommendations that we make can't change legislation in 2024. So some of the conversation that we're having now, we just may be stuck with as we slog through 2023, but it doesn't mean we can't help shape the next cycle as we get to it.
Agreed. All right. With that said, I know utilities and most people haven't had a chance to go over thoroughly what OPC filed or sent around this morning. So I don't really want to have another meeting. I'm happy to allow parties to file comments in response to OPC's comments if folks want it. Yes, Scott.
I just want to thank OPC and VESE for those comments and the work that they did behind there. So I just wanted to put that out there, and we appreciate that.
Gotcha. Anybody from the utilities want an opportunity to respond in writing? All right. Then I guess we'll move on. I guess you have until the end of the meeting, I guess, to change your mind. All right. Let's move on to net versus gross. Now, Nicole, I think you submitted something in response to the utilities to email Lindsay had sent out indicating that, well, I don't want to eat. It was something to the effect that the utilities were okay with Joe Loper's proposal, and I think the OPC was okay with that. I guess it might be helpful. Joe, do you recall what your proposal was?
Yes, and actually, I believe this is a joint Dan Hurley, Joe Loper proposal.
Okay.
For that that we could, in addition to or in lieu of the change in the goal or using a net savings goal, could have an annual report that would be part of either of the verification report or a standalone memo that would be filed with the commission to highlight the net to gross ratios for all the programs and provide some contextual discussion around them, including, for example, that net to gross ratios low net to gross does not necessarily mean you should shut your program down, and other things like that. Just, explaining what net to gross means, because that's ultimately the big problem here is people don't understand or even know that they need to know. So that was what we were proposing, that could at least address probably the biggest concern that we had about having a gross goal, which is that people don't realize that they think that that's what the Empower programs induced, when actually a portion of that savings just happened to happen anyway. I think that covers it.
Okay, and my understanding of Lindsay's email was that they were supportive of that proposal, and I believe OPC is now on board with that proposal as well.
Yes, Your Honor.
All
Yes.
right. Does anybody else have concerns with Joe's proposal? Do you still want to go with net? Do you still want to just go with gross?
I'm not sure it's my place to ask, but I think Jim Gravatt was.
That's I was waiting for Jim to weigh in here. I was going to call on him if he didn't.
I was typing something into the chat, trying to not take up so much room. But yeah, we can go with that proposal. That's
okay.
That's reasonable.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, sir. All right. Anybody else on that? All right. Maybe we end on a high note. All right. Okay. So the last thing I had on my list was Scott's, I don't want to say issue, but that he had raised it a couple of times with the solar and the low income. I guess OPC touched on it a little bit. Folks, yes, Joe.
Sorry, Judge. I think Dan also sent a document around to the group yesterday afternoon about alignment of ex post evaluation findings and ex ante assumptions used in the program plan analyses. So I just wanted to flag that for you for after this discussion, that we might want to touch that.
Okay. I don't know if I got that memo. If I did, I missed it. All right. I appreciate it. But if I missed that, just remind me. So, all right. Again, low income and solar. Again, OPC seems to be on board with the concept. Do we want to discuss it any further? Okay. All right. Dan, you sent around something yesterday?
Yes, I did. As Joe was saying, it's a very short 2-paragraph. I guess we'll call it a memo.
Oh, yep. Okay, I know what you're talking about now. I got it.
It was really the EAG kind of reached agreement on how we're going to treat the alignment of the ex post evaluation with the planning assumptions as well. So we just thought, for full transparency, we would share that with this group. And Joe, if you have anything you want to add on to that.
Yeah, well, one thing we were struggling, as written, it's non-controversial in the EAG anyway. It was It's non-binding on the utilities. The utilities can ultimately use whatever assumptions they want, but this has them at least just flag for stakeholders and others like Dan and me where there are differences. And so the utilities were fully, and the EAG were fully complicit in this. In fact, it was we co-wrote it. And then the reason that we're bringing it, Dan and I are, and we talked to the EAG yesterday, that we all agreed that we should throw this at Judge McLean is because there's really no other place for it to go. And it fits in with this, with the guidance or recommendations that would be coming out of this work group. So that's why it's there. But some of the people, I know that the utility representatives in the EAG are not one and the same a lot of times with the people, the utility representatives in this group. And so you may not be quite familiar with it. So you may want to go talk it through with the EAG representatives if you're concerned about it. But I think it was, it was non-controversial the way it's written.
All right, thanks. Jim.
If I could just request Dan or somebody to forward that to me. Dan, I don't know if you replied to the email that Chris Walls sent out, but there's something in the utility algorithm that seems to be removing my name from the distribution list. Mr. Walls was generous enough to consider whether that might have happened again and sent that the comments to me. But if you could send it, that would be great.
I will.
It was sent at 2:15 p.m. yesterday.
I just tried to forward it to you, sir.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
For anybody who can't find it.
All right. All right. Yeah. All right. Obviously, I can't ask Jim what his thoughts are. While Jim's hopefully pulling that up now, anybody want to weigh in on this 2-paragraph memo that Dan sent around yesterday?
Judge, can I ask Nicole? You're okay with it, right? And Jennifer actually wasn't in the meeting yesterday, but we've had discussions around it. Or the people who are participants in the EAG, Babatunde and others. Does anybody have any objections to it? Or
I don't believe so, Joe. And yes, I was in the meeting yesterday and we did not have any concerns. We'll just take one more final look right now, but I don't think there's a problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Jim. I see you unmute yourself.
No objections to this statement. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Anybody else want to be heard on this? All right. All right. That's all I have on my agenda. Is there anything that I missed or anything that anybody else wants to talk about? All right. Well, I think that's it then. Judge Burke and I will work to get the remaining portions of the report out to everyone as quickly as we can, and we'll look forward to your edits. All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.